Well, I have been reminded over and over and over and over again to watch the clock, but my batteries are wearing down. When we moved here, 6 months ago or so, we knew what we were getting into with respect to the cold weather, the snows. Certainly this assembly had a lot to do with our choosing Wabasha. But what probably nobody here knows about me is I'm kind of a bird watcher at heart. And what we have found in the last couple of weeks is like an avian explosion along the Mississippi River. And there are a lot of birds that are resident in the east side of the Mississippi that we don't, or the Rockies, I suppose, that we don't have on the west side. And so it's opening up a whole new world of birds to me that I have never seen before. And Margaret gets to enjoy the bird life as well, although she has to kind of temper my enthusiasm, because when I say, a wood duck, a yellow-rumped warbler, a pied-billed grebe, she says, a duck, a little brown job, right? A gull. In fact, she would say a seagull, right? But the one thing we are both thoroughly enjoying together are the bald eagles. Now, we knew we were coming to bald eagle country with the National Eagle Center here and all that. But there's been hardly a day go by where we haven't been sitting at home and seeing eagles out our sunroom, or working out in the yard and seeing them fly over, or driving around the region here and seeing some days dozens of them. It's pretty amazing. Now, you don't have to be an ornithologist or an Eagle Scout to be able to spot a bald eagle. Anyone, pretty much, who was born in these United States can look at an eagle and recognize that's an eagle. That's the symbol of our country, right? The national symbol has the bald eagle on it with arrows in one talon and an olive branch clenched in the other. And it's looking toward the olive branch side, because we're always ready to put up our dukes, but we look towards peace. So we see the eagle, we hear the eagle, the mention of the eagle, and we know what it means. It warms our hearts to know that there's an eagle out there. Someone says, look, there's an eagle. Nobody has to go in their head, was that the yellow-rumped warbler? Was it the pied-billed grebe? Was it the wood duck? No, it's a bald eagle. Well, we didn't come here to talk ornithology. So turn, if you will, to Matthew in chapter 8. Now, what we're going to discuss this morning is outside of our discussion of John and his gospel. However, it's very relevant to understanding the mindset of the Jews and the Pharisees that were leaders for the Jews. And so as we go through John and we continue under Scott's direction through Matthew, Jerry's taking us through Luke and others, just keep in mind that all of these gospel references have this sort of understanding as the backdrop. So I'm going to start right at the beginning here. When he came down from the mountain, great crowds followed him. And behold, a leper came to him and knelt before him, saying, Lord, if you will, you can make me clean. And Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him, saying, I will be clean. And immediately the leprosy was cleansed. And Jesus said to him, See that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourselves to the priests, and offer the gift that Moses commanded for proof to them." So Jesus healed many lepers during his walk here on the earth. But this one stands out above all of the rest for a simple reason. Before Jesus came physically to the earth, the rabbis had separated out all of the possible miracles into two jars. One jar, they said, anyone who is under the influence of the Holy Spirit of God can perform these miracles. The other jar, though, they said, those miracles only God can perform. And in fact, God or his anointed one, the Messiah. The Messiah would come and perform these miracles and offer them as proof of his messiahship. The first and foremost of those messianic miracles, and there's 4 of them, is the cleansing of a leper. The Jews call it tzaurat. It means inflicted, because a leper obviously has to be inflicted by God because of some sin or indiscretion in their life. They call this the finger of God. God reaching out, zatdu, and giving that person leprosy. If you remember back, Moses was inflicted for a moment with leprosy, a leprous hand. And God did this to show Moses his power. And Moses took his hand back out, and it was fine. Miriam, Moses' sister, Miriam and Aaron, his brother, spoke out against Moses, and God inflicted Miriam with leprosy. And Moses prayed earnestly that God would heal her, and he did at Moses' request. Uzziah, one of the kings of Israel, Uzziah went into the temple, into the holiest place inside the temple to sacrifice against God's will and his word in the law. And God inflicted him with leprosy, and he suffered under leprosy until he died about a decade later because of his sin. The only person in the Old Testament to be healed was the Syrian general named Naaman, who went to Elisha, the prophet, and said, "I have leprosy, and I know that your God can heal this." And God did through Elisha's ministry. And actually, Jesus points that out to the Jews, and we'll probably talk about that in a minute, right? So no Israelite had ever been cleansed of leprosy after the Torah was given, after the law. Right? Not a one. And yet, when God gave the law, in Leviticus 13 and 14, he gives explicit instructions to the priests, the Levites, how to examine people with different types of skin diseases. And in chapter 14, what you do if someone comes to you and says, "I've been healed of leprosy." And there's a whole long list of things and sacrifices that have been offered, and timelines of how the priests are supposed to observe the person for 7 days and offer another sacrifice and then observe them for another 7 days and these sorts of things. So even though it had never been used, and I'm sure God knew that it would not be used until his son came some 1,500 years later. So we have this situation in Matthew chapter 8 where Jesus is approached by a leper who must have great faith to say, "I will be healed if you say so." And Luke records the same event in Luke chapter 5, and in verse 12, Luke, the physician, says, there came a man full of leprosy. It's the same situation, but Luke gives it a little bit more description because he's a physician, and he says the man is full of leprosy. The Greek word for full here is pleres, and you've probably remembered me mentioning before, Jesus is pleroma. He is the fullness of God. And you, believer, are pleroo. You are filled with God. Jesus can't get any more God. You can't get any more filled with Jesus. And Luke uses the same word here. This man was full of leprosy. He was probably days from death's door. And Jesus cleansed him. And then he told him to go and follow the Mosaic law. Follow the chapter 14 of Leviticus. And the priests will examine you over time and determine that you are cleansed. Right? And at the end of that time, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the Levites, they all should have seen this and said, whoa, this man has to be Messiah, because only God can cleanse a leper, and God's Messiah, who will use that as testimony. Okay, let's move forward. Flip over to Matthew chapter 12. And while you're doing that, I'll go ahead and start at verse 22. Then a demon-oppressed man who was blind and mute was brought to him, and he healed him, so that the man spoke and saw. And all the people were amazed and said, "Can this be the son of David?" But the Pharisees heard it, and they said, "It is only by Beelzebub, the prince of demons, that this man casts out demons." Casting out a mute demon, one that can't speak and prevents the person that he has indwelled from speaking, is the second messianic miracle. The rabbis had a formula for casting out demons. They would approach the demon-possessed person, ask for the demon's name, the demon would respond with his name, and then the rabbi would cast out the demon with the demon's own name. Right? But a mute demon can't give the name. So only God can cast out a mute demon, because only God would know the demon's name. And so we have here Jesus casting out a demon from a man who had caused muteness. You would think that the Pharisees would say, wow, remember that other thing, the leper thing? Right? And now we have him casting out a mute demon. This is Messiah. But they didn't. What did they say instead? He's casting out using the name of Beelzebub, the prince of the demons, instead of casting out using the name of the Holy Spirit. That, my friends, is the unpardonable sin. And it is reserved for this generation of Jews that said that. That's another story entirely. And then we have John in chapter 9. And it opens with, as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. So the man's not possessed by a demon. He's blind from birth. And the disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him." Remember, Jesus made a poultice with his spit, put it on the man's eyes, told the man to go to the pool of Bethsaida or Bethesda and to wash, and then present himself to the priests. Well, healing birth defects is the third messianic miracle, right? Because rabbis taught that birth defects were a punishment from God. Nate and Alyssa, the Jews had it wrong on so many fronts, Put it out of your mind, okay? The Jews taught that from Exodus, from the law, that God would punish the parents to the third and fourth generation through their offspring. And only God, Exodus 4:11 says, God is saying, who makes a man mute or deaf or seeing or blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Right? They taught that birth defects were specifically caused by God, could only be removed by God or by his anointed one, who is using it to present himself as Messiah. How many times did Jesus heal people born with birth defects? Men lame since birth, men blind since birth. The gospel accounts are full of those, right? So that was the third messianic miracle. The fourth is so outlandish that some rabbis don't even teach that it's a messianic miracle because it ain't ever happening, right? And the fourth is raising a person from the dead after 3 days. Rabbis taught that the spirit of a person who has died hovers above the body for a period of 3 days. And then a person could be resuscitated anytime during those 3 days. But after 3 days, the spirit of the individual leaves, and corruption and decay move into the body, and the person is lost forever. Right? That's why the healing of Lazarus is so miraculous. And that's why Jesus waited until the fourth day to show up. And that's why it was so heart-wrenching for him that by the time he did show up, the emotion of who Jesus is as God and as man just welled up in him, and Jesus wept because of all that he knew about what was going to happen, and yet he had to allow that to happen to his dear friend. Right? John 11 records this miracle, and we'll go through that when we get there in the study of John. So in seeing this fourth messianic miracle, the Sanhedrin should have easily declared Jesus Messiah. Right? Look, an eagle. Everybody knows what it looks like. It's got the white head, the white tail, an 8-foot wingspan, beautiful soaring bird. When they're sitting in a tree, they look like the James Dean of birds, right? They are cool, right? And now, here Jesus has performed not one, not two, but 4 miracles that only God could do, or only God's Messiah, his anointed one, could do, presenting his messiahship. The Jews were not stupid. They saw that Jesus was Messiah, and yet they purposely rejected him. The leaders standing on their pedestals to keep their position. Right? But there's a second set of circumstances also, not just the messianic miracles, that goes along with their rejection. The other set of circumstances is that the Jews had a twofold messiahship, if you will. They also divided out the prophecies regarding Messiah in the Old Testament. And they put some into a jar that said these belong to Messiah, the son of Joseph, Mashiach ben Joseph, the suffering servant. And some of the prophecies belong to Messiah, the son of David, Mashiach ben David, who is the exalted ruler. And today, and over the last 2,000 years, and it started at Jesus' time, the rabbis kind of were dividing out the two messiahs, so that now they actually teach that there are two separate individuals, two separate men. So let's look just briefly at the son of Joseph. The suffering service. He brings food and good news to the poor. He comforts the downhearted. He sets the captives free. He heals the lame, and in fact, he even raises from the dead. And so we have many prophecies in the Old Testament that point to those aspects of Messiah. Each one of the references that I found over the years, points to Isaiah 61. And it specifically, there's many of the prophecies that they always quote, but this is always the first one. Is that the Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Remember when Jesus went to Nazareth in the synagogue and they handed him the scroll to read for the day? And he opened it up to this passage and he read this. And what did he say? Today this is fulfilled in your hearing. Jesus is proclaiming to be Messiah ben Joseph, the son of Joseph. What he didn't finish reading is the rest of the passage, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God, to comfort all who mourn, because there will be a time when he returns as Messiah ben David, where he will vanquish the foes of God. He will mete out justice and usher in the day of vengeance for God. And then he will calm those who mourn. Right? So we could talk all day about Messiah ben Joseph and Messiah ben David. The only thing I want to focus on Messiah ben David is hearkening back to last Sunday and Palm Sunday and the message we heard last week. Zechariah 9:9 says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Now, the Jews still see this as a messianic passage, that their Messiah will come riding on a donkey. And he did. They just reject that. In the 15th century, there was a rabbi who wrote a commentary of the Old Testament for the Jews. His name is Rabbi Shlomo Itzhaki, and the Jews collectively call him Rashi. And Rashi noted of this verse, he said, "It is impossible to interpret this except as referring to the King Messiah. As it's stated from Psalm 72, and his rule shall be from sea to sea. We do not find that Israel had such a ruler during the days of the Second Temple." Well, yeah, they did, but he just had a different task to complete at that time, and he did. Right? Messiah ben David, the son of David, will be a strong ruler from Judah so that he has a right to rule, and he will claim David's throne. He will unite Israel. He will end the times of the Gentiles. So clearly, Jesus fulfills both the son of Joseph and the son of David aspects of Messiah. So let's wrap this all up. On Palm Sunday, Jesus was entering the gates of Jerusalem. And the texts that record this all reference something about Lazarus. Jesus was coming, and the people heard about him raising Lazarus from the dead from testimony of their family and friends, and they were gathering to see this man who had raised Lazarus from the dead and in fact must be Messiah. Right? And they were shouting, "He is Messiah. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even King of Israel." Baruch habo b'shem Adonai. Baruch habo b'shem Yitzhak Israel. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel. And yet just a few days later, the crowds were shouting, "Crucify him." What happened? Are they that stupid? Are they that blind? No. Look, an eagle. They knew he was Messiah. But he wasn't the Messiah that they wanted. He had fulfilled the aspects of Messiah ben Joseph. He had not yet fulfilled and claimed David's throne as Messiah ben David, the son of David. But they were proclaiming him as such. But by the end of the week, he hadn't gone in and kicked Rome out. He hadn't done what they wanted him to do. And so then it was, let's get rid of him. And the crowds were really easy for the rabbis to turn. The triumphal entry occurs in Matthew 21 is where it's positioned. And we looked at that passage last week. During the next few days, the rabbis and the people examined Jesus again, and he was presenting himself as the unblemished lamb. And yet, in Matthew 23, just two chapters later, we have Jesus taking the Pharisees and the religious leaders to the woodshed. He says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stone those who are sent to it, how often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate, for I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, Baruch habo b'shem Adonai." Wait a minute, just a couple days before, they had been saying that about him, right? It's because they wanted him to be somebody that he wasn't yet ready to be. The Messiah, son of David, right? He was that Messiah, but he had to finish his work as Messiah ben Joseph first and go to the cross and then to the tomb and then to be raised and ascended to the Father. They'd already declared that he was Messiah by shouting, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel." That's Jesus. And yet they rejected him. So, this is where it can apply to us. Consider these points as you're studying the Gospels and studying about Jesus, and see that the Jews are not a stupid people. The Pharisees were not stupid. They were extremely learned. But they refused to accept Jesus as Messiah because he would take away their position. The people would all follow him. They would lose their place. Right? The responses and the rejection of the Jews was not out of ignorance. It was out of knowledge. Seeing how the Jews responded to him should encourage us to accept Jesus as he is, not as we want him to be. We often want to think that Jesus is our bridge over troubled water. Well, no, he gave us life when we were dead. Right? Sometimes the trouble in our life is our own doing, and Jesus will help us to extricate ourselves. However, there's always earthly consequence to our folly. And he may not be in a position where he wants us to get out of that. Or he may lead us into those situations. Look what a miserable life the Apostle Paul must have lived if he had just looked on his own woes, and yet he looked at Jesus and knew that he was doing the work Jesus wanted him to do. So whatever Jesus allowed to come his way. Beatings, torture, shipwrecks, all of those things were a joy for him to endure because it was for the Lord. So let's look at Jesus not as the suffering servant alone, or even the exalted ruler alone. Let's see him as we know he is now, because of the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, that he is even the author and the perfecter of our faith. In Hebrews, in the very first chapter verse of chapter 12, the writer says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely. And let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted." Jesus did not stay dead in the tomb. He endured all of that, but he raised himself. The triune God, each person had a hand in Jesus' resurrection. He conquered death. He rose from the grave. He ascended into heaven. He was glorified by God when God accepted his sacrifice as perfect and finished and seated him on the right hand of his own throne. Right? Jesus is risen. Wabasha Mn. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Let's close in prayer.